On this, the place for history on KY3's digital desk, we're not talking about presidents, we're not visiting a Smithsonian, we're staying local here, but we are talking about something that's related to Hollywood with Reverend Inman here of the Wilder Home and Museum, Laura Ingalls Wilder Home and Museum.
Correct.
It's kind of a mouthful, the name, but it's
absolutely.
really an important part of the Ozarks, having that right here, just out 60,
Yes.
not too far from Springfield.
A treasure of the Ozarks.
Yes.
Great place where we've preserved so much history, and we'd love to have you and everybody else listening to come and visit.
Yeah, and we're going to get into when you can visit and be there at a festival in just a minute.
Sure.
First thing I want to talk about, we're fast approaching the 50th anniversary.
Yeah.
The 50th anniversary of the very first airing of Little House on the Prairie. The regular series premiered on NBC on September 11th, 1974. What connection does the show have, the Hollywood show, have to the home in Mansfield?
That's a good question. We're asked that a lot. And there used to be kind of two camps. The purists, who were all about the books, and those who were just fans of the television show. But as time has gone by and the years have passed, you've seen a real melting of that. And the Wilder home has a unique opportunity. You know, we present the factual story of Laura Ingalls Wilder, but generally we see people coming in the doors because they are fans of the television show. So they have a concept of a storyline that we're able to at least start with and say, you know, the story, the Little House on the Prairie television show began with Mrs. Wilder's fourth book in the 1970s. About 1972, Ed Friendly, who was an NBC executive and producer, was encouraged by his family, I believe, to obtain the film and television rights to Mrs. Wilder's books. He did, contacted Roger Lee McBride, who was, of course, heir to the Little House world. She was kind of like an adopted grandson of Rose Wilder Lane. Roger, his father, had been one of Rose Wilder Lane's editors. And so they formed this relationship, and I guess he trusted him with this responsibility, and thus began the pilot. Ed Friendly reaches out to Michael Landon and says, hey, will you direct the pilot? And Michael Landon, being a smart businessman, says, absolutely I will, if I can play Pa Ingalls. And of course the rest is history. So we see many people coming through the doors of the Wilder home who've never cracked open one of the books because they've watched 9 seasons and 200 and some episodes of the television show. And so you really have a teaching opportunity there.
What is the major difference that people don't know between the television show with Pa and Ma
Sure.
and Melissa Gilbert and then the books themselves?
Absolutely.
It didn't start with book number 1, as you mentioned.
Right. So what's interesting about it is the Wilders were only in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. I shouldn't say the Wilders, the Ingalls family were only in Walnut Grove, Minnesota for a few years. Laura was probably between the ages 7 and 9. But how do you take a storyline then and stretch it over 9 seasons? So they got creative, they had to add characters, they did all kinds of things. And we're talking, this is a storyline in the books of the 1870s when the Ingalls are residing there in a dugout along Plum Creek. So they had to really get creative to build these storylines. And we get these questions all the time. People will come in and say, in the historic farmhouse, which room belonged to Albert? And say, well, the docents will have to say, Albert was a fictional character from the television show, and people will argue with you about that. No, Albert Ingalls existed. We watched him on television. So it's a real teaching moment to be able to say, you know, this is the truth, this is reality, and this is, of course, a television show. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's Hollywood, right?
Exactly.
And that brings in people and engages them in a story, and that's why they're still watching 50 years later.
So the family, Laura's family.
Yes.
This show goes on, and it does take off from the books.
Yeah.
It doesn't stick to the books
starts
because
there
it goes beyond.
And grows, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So what do they think about this? I mean, the show did wind up dealing with some serious issues. It dealt with poverty, with blindness, with racism. These are not easy topics to address on a show like this. So how did they feel about the way all that was handled?
Of course, Mrs. Wilder doesn't have any living direct descendants. So we've had conversations amongst the staff. What do you think Laura Ingalls Wilder would have thought of Little House on the Prairie, which, you know, Mrs. Wilder passed away in 1957, so she, of course, didn't see that. Rose passes away in 1968, her daughter. She doesn't live to see that. So that's all speculative, but you'd have to think that she'd be fascinated that people would be watching her story on television. You know, she had a life that saw lots of developments in technology. To think that your life story in some capacity, in some form, would be on a television somewhere in somebody's home in their living room, I think she'd be fascinated by that.
For several seasons.
Yes, and when you listen to cast members talk about that special time in their life as cast members working on the show, I think they were really proud that they delved into topics that not everybody was dealing with. And they can look back on their body of work and think, hey, we really reached out to a lot of areas that really were inclusive to many different stories that not everybody else was doing.
You've met several of the cast members.
Yes.
And you've met them at the Cherry Blossom Festival more than once.
Absolutely.
This past year included.
Yes, the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival in Marshfield welcomes a variety of cast members every year at the end of April. And then at Rocky Ridge, we've been fortunate for years to welcome a lot of the characters from the show, the cast members who have become household names to Wilder fans. And it's so much fun to watch their interaction. And this special anniversary year, we've been watching as they've been making appearances across the country. And, you know, thousands of people are showing up. They had a big event in Simi Valley, California. And when you look at the thousands of people that were in line to meet them, I think they were even amazed after all these years.
And if somebody's fascinated by that, you're going to have an event coming up in just a couple of weeks in Mansfield.
Yes.
At the farm, if I can call it the farm.
Yeah, Rocky Ridge Farm.
Yeah.
It's the 49th annual Wilder Day celebration, and it's not just at Rocky Ridge, it's also in the historic downtown of Mansfield.
Okay.
But we will bring Pa's fiddle out that day and play it a couple times, and fans love that. I always say the fiddle is really the last surviving character of the books.
Right.
And people love that. But Dean Butler will be there. Of course, people will remember him as Almanzo Wilder, or Almanzo from the television show, as they would call it. And they'll have an opportunity to come into our museum gallery, to meet him, to get an autograph, have a picture taken. It'll be a great time. And on the Friday night, we'll have our Wilder dinner. We're raising money to redo the Rock House roof. And so there's always historic preservation going on to preserve Laura Ingalls Wilder's life story, even beyond the television show.
And the importance of the Rock House, let's get into that as you talk about preserving it and raising money for the roof.
Absolutely.
That's important in the writing of these books in what way?
Mrs. Wilder wrote her first 4 books while living at the Rock House. We often forget that Mrs. Wilder's daughter Rose was a famous writer in her own right. So she'd gone out into the world and was making a name for herself, and in the 1920s comes back to Rocky Ridge Farm and decides she's going to move into the Wilder's farmhouse. And she decides to build them a rock house, which could be very typical, the look of a little English cottage kind of a setting.
And we've seen some houses in the Ozarks that kind of look like that, too.
Absolutely, and you know, visitors are very drawn. You're either Camp Rock House or Camp Farmhouse, and they really are drawn to that. But I think even though it was a nice gift from Rose to her parents, it wasn't home.
Yeah.
You know, they had put sweat equity into the farmhouse. They designed the house the way they wanted it. That was home. So after several years, from about 1928 to 1936, Mrs. Wilder decides, I'm going home. And she's walked back and forth from the Rock House to the farmhouse, taking her manuscripts to Rose, the writer, saying, you know, should I change this, should I change that? And Rose has advised her mother. She's very helpful to her in this process. And so she's all over Rocky Ridge Farm as she's writing these books, but she ultimately goes home, and we know, of course, that she writes the rest of the books while living in the farmhouse.
Okay.
But the Rock House is a significant portion of the story of Rocky Ridge Farm, and its preservation is important, just as it is with the farmhouse. We have a lot of acreage, almost 200 acres to maintain,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
of course lots of structures on the property. And we want people to be able to walk through the door and see things the way that Mrs. Wilder would have seen them and experience them in that authentic nature. So this preservation work is important.
And if someone hasn't been there
Sure.
and they go to visit, the walk isn't like, it's not like a long walk between the two.
No, but of course you're also a person who's running and walking all the time. You know?
Yeah.
So we get people all the time will say, "Oh, I'm going to walk that," and then it's in the heat of the summer or something, and they
gotcha.
begin to regret their decision halfway over there. But the comment is always, "Mrs. Wilder must have really been fit. You know, she's a little tiny woman. She's making this trek back and forth with her manuscript. She must have really been a strong farm woman." You know, but it's a beautiful view. A different view of the farm than what you're seeing just driving from one house to the next. So I always encourage visitors to try to do that if they're physically able.
Okay, so maybe perspective from you.
There you go.
Because it didn't strike me as a super long
No,
walk.
you'd be the first one across the path.
So if there are fans of the show out there and they didn't realize that this picks up later in the series, what did they miss in book 1 and 2 that they think never really happened, that could have been in the show?
Well, of course, the first book, Little House in the Big Woods, tells the story of the early years of Laura's life. And then the second book is Farmer Boy, and it goes into Mr. Wilder's story. So I always encourage little boys, you know, pick up Farmer Boy because there's something in there that you're going to jump out of you. But as a third grader, my third grade teacher read to us on the banks of Plum Creek. And that was the first story that I was exposed to. And so when I tell people when they're reading them, I don't always necessarily encourage them to read them in order, because I think on the banks of Plum Creek, I'm a little biased, but it's my favorite book.
Okay.
And I'm always finding copies and buying copies to give as gifts, because I think third graders, that's a good age to begin reading the books. And then once you've grabbed their attention, I always say, then go back and begin. Because the first book has a lot of details in it. You know, she's describing things like food and lots of things that a young reader might not always be drawn to.
Yeah.
Not that that's not interesting, that's just my personal opinion about it.
So as the director of the museum and the home, you have these projects in front of you, including the roof project.
Yeah.
How do you preserve this history yet move into the future? Because the show's been off the air for a while,
Absolutely.
the book's still in print, but there hasn't been a new book in a long time.
Absolutely.
So how do you keep that progress going forward?
That's a challenge. You know, we have a great team, our staff, and of course we work hand in hand with the Laura Ingalls Wilder Home Association, which has ownership of the property. And we're always having to make decisions and just have discussions about how do we take Mrs. Wilder's story to the future. Not every classroom is cracking open the books anymore. Not every class is walking through the door on a field trip as they once did. Although we still welcome thousands of visitors every year from all over the world, how do you continue to engage that populace? You know, we now see people bringing in their great-grandchildren and their grandchildren who, you know, in 1957, when we first started welcoming visitors, we had a generation that was pretty fresh in knowledge of all things that were interesting to Laura Ingalls Wilder, but now we're several generations that are visiting. So we look at, one, the preservation, second, the presentation. How do you engage the actual visitor in the museum gallery? How are children learning today? How will they absorb this story? We send speakers into the school to speak about Mrs. Wilder. We started our Laura Ingalls Wilder Children's Literature Festival, which engages you know, like 4th, 5th graders in coming to Mansfield, hearing from local authors, and then they visit the Wilder home. So we've tried every way in the world to get outside of the box to find different ways to relate to children and the next generation who will be charged with the preservation of Mrs. Wilder's life story.
Okay, before we go, September 27th and 28th in Mansfield. That's
right.
Wilder Days.
Uh-huh.
And is there a website people need to go to? Do you need to register ahead of time if you want to go to this
no,
event?
it's just open to the public.
Okay.
They can, if they're on Facebook, they can visit the Mansfield Area Chamber of Commerce Facebook page.
Okay.
They can visit the Wilder Home Facebook page or website and learn all those details. But from music to pause fiddle to, as I said, Dean Butler. We have a little bit of everything that weekend. Morgan horses. Mr. Wilder loved Morgan horses, and the Morgan Horse Association brings the Morgan horses out, and we have children's games in the yard. There's a little bit of fun for everybody that weekend.
All right. Reverend Nicholas Inman, are you going to play music for us in
not,
Wilder Days?
They're not that desperate. We want people to come to Mansfield.
I gotcha. Yeah. Reverend Inman, we appreciate your time talking about the 50th anniversary of Little House on the Prairie on the Place for History on the KY3 Digital Desk.